Hello, and welcome to the first of our six-part series of conversations where we look into the impact of technology and engineering in a post-COVID-19 new normal. My name is Carlos Gonzalez, Special Projects Manager at Mechanical Engineering Magazine and ASME.org. Today our focus is on better resiliency and re-engineering risk post-COVID-19. As we all know, COVID-19 pandemic started to impact the engineering industry from design to manufacturing to supply chains and the engineering workforce, and the cracks in our processes started to show. One lesson is that we must improve not only the factory in the supply chains, but also to explore alternative manufacturing processes and placing greater resilience on digital twins, rapid prototyping, and to create a more robust local supply chain. For the next 6 weeks, we will be expanding on these conversations, bringing you conversations on safer workplaces, improving supply chains, deploying a more robust robotic workforce, and how to manufacture smarter. For today's conversation, I'm pleased to welcome two guests who will show us what the path forward will be once the pandemic is over. Our first guest is Professor Joseph Agor, an assistant professor of industrial engineering at Oregon State University in the School of Mechanical, Industrial, and Manufacturing Engineering. His main research is in data-driven optimization and then using linear, integer, and multi-level optimization techniques to develop data-driven decision support tools and to help decision makers in the healthcare system, both at the patient level and at the system level. Our second guest is David Brea. He is the Americas lead for manufacturing and resources industries at Microsoft. He and his team are responsible for developing and delivering high-impact solutions that empower their customers to lead digital businesses in their industries. David brings over 30 years of experience in several engineering industries, including automotive, aerospace, industrial, and medical device industries. He has a degree in electrical engineering from GM Engineering and Management Institute, now known as the Kettering University, and an MBA from the University of Chicago for Booth Graduate School of Business. Gentlemen, welcome. Before we begin, I want to thank our supporters. COMSOL Multiphysics, a simulation platform for engineering design, part manufacturing, and scientific research, and Xcentric Mold and Engineering, a trusted supplier for time-critical injection molding services. For our audience, before we get started, I want to let them know that if they have any questions for our speakers, they can enter them in the question window, and we'll respond to those questions at a later date. Gentlemen, let's get started. This crisis started as a regular supply chain problem in China and quickly engulfed the whole world. Why don't you walk us through your timelines over the last few months and how your organizations have responded to the pandemic? David, let's start with you.
Very good. Yeah, as a device manufacturer with production facilities in China, we saw the impact very quickly in our own operations, but that was also echoed by many of our customers. I think in manufacturing in particular, we almost saw this dichotomy of companies that literally had their forecast eviscerated, like looking at zero demand, and then others that saw scale order of magnitude improvements. And so that was kind of the early take. Obviously, there was a rolling wave depending on where you were in the world. And I think here locally, the initial focus was more on containment than actual response. So it took a little while for what we saw over in Asia to really materialize here in the US. But that said, with some of the longer supply chains, and as you get into the component materials that are proprietary or highly engineered, those tend to have longer lead times. And so as much as the demand side experienced a pretty big shock, once companies were trying to figure out how to satisfy the demand that did exist, they saw equal shocks on the supply side. So what was interesting to us is the companies that had started down their transformation journey, where they had connected factories or they had some of the data to be able to have visibility across their value chains, they tended to be able to get mobilized a lot quicker than those that had not.
And Professor Agor, being in the school setting, How did your university respond to the COVID-19 pandemic? And can you also comment on how the medical data infrastructure was equipped for the task? Were they up to monitoring or were they underperforming?
Yeah, so thank you again, Rose, for having me on. Appreciate it. So to your first question, Oregon State, they were closely monitoring the situation since early November. We constantly got updates from our leadership about what the university was going to do, and at around March, during the last week of our spring term, they announced that we were going remote. I think that was the third week of March, and we would be on remote until further notice after the governor here in Oregon established the stay-at-home order that she did. So that was kind of Oregon State's response. Now, with respect to your question about the medical data infrastructure, prior to the pandemic, there was not necessarily, I guess, a need for kind of monitoring maybe the workforce and their health. Not as much anyway. If an employee got sick, they would be referred to their doctor, and you could go to the doctor and get that type of information. So the monitoring, I think, was limited in that capacity for the workforce specifically. And when the pandemic hit, there was a surgence of need for medical monitoring and an infrastructure that needed to be set up in order to monitor the workforce. And so I think monitor was simply not a thing. Monitoring the workforce was not a thing, because again, it wasn't as large a threat, right? Prior to the COVID-19 pandemic.
David, could you comment on how some of your customers responded to the pandemic? Did they shift their workforces to digital solutions? Did they increase their remote working? Or did they increase their digital tools in response to a lack of manufacturing? How were they able to substitute that on-site presence?
Yeah, the crisis response, the immediate response was the recognition that people weren't going to be able to travel, and that a lot of the physical and manual roles that were previously filled by workers in these facilities would have to take on a different type of a mode going forward. So the way that we saw the leaders kind of respond was, number one, to really get their teams organized. That almost always started with remote work tools and collaboration tools. It also really focused a restructuring in the organization into daily workrooms, and being able to almost run processes that in the past were done over weeks or months into daily type operations. So if you think of S&OP planning, supplier scheduling, trying to really balance inventory with demand, those became almost like real-time processes without the necessary infrastructure or applications to support them. I think once that initial response was kind of met and some of the variability was becoming better recognized, there was the whole challenge of turning these facilities back on, being able to allow people to come back to work on a limited basis. And to what the professor shared is being able to both scan people. We're seeing technology being used to ensure compliance of PPE at the beginning and during shifts, and then being able to come up with ways that we can bring engineering capacity to plants, to DCs, to other points in between with remote assistance. And so those are kind of the immediate things that we saw the leaders respond with. I think there's another set of capabilities we're seeing emerging as some of the lockdowns are being lifted, but I'll talk about that later.
David, could you comment on how some of your customers responded to the pandemic? Did they shift their workforces to digital solutions? Did they increase their remote working? Or did they increase their digital tools in response to a lack of manufacturing? How were they able to substitute that on-site presence?
Yeah, I think it depends on where you are and whether or not your products are deemed essential or not. And so in those cases, if you go walk the production lines, it doesn't look that much different, with the exception that they may have partitions or they're staggering shifts, right? They're trying to maintain social distancing in these facilities. In other cases, the plants are mothballed, right? And it becomes more of a quest for liquidity. So trying to find inventory and be able to fulfill orders that way. In other cases, companies are basically retrofitting their facilities to make new products, right? We were one of the partners involved in the UK ventilator challenge, which, you know, literally went from a phone call with Boris Johnson before he went to the hospital to making 20,000 ventilators 3 weeks later, right? Just an incredible effort between industry, academia, and some of the underlying technology partners.
Professor Agor, in terms of the engineers that have had to stay on site and start returning to the workforce, can you comment on how data can be used and how IoT networks can be used to maintain an informed workforce with monitoring their health and ensuring that we have a safe work environment?
Yeah, that's a great question, Carlos. And it appears that the workforce currently is enforcing and monitoring, like David said, their employees as well as their customers as we slowly look to reopen, through temperature checks prior to entering. A lot are using technologies that automatically detect temperatures and all this, all these types of tools that are being used. And in a healthcare setting, in a hospital setting, and some information that I've gathered over my research, these types of risk stratification tools that are used to track patients in hospitals can help create and be transitioned to the workforce environment, right? So this connectivity that we have, this IoT that we have, we're able to potentially, there's a potential for companies to integrate the information that they're gathering, for their employees, for their customers, with some local EHR systems. Now, this could be a very undertaking task, as you can imagine. But then the tools that are being developed in the health system engineering world and the personalized medicine world can be used to assess risk within the workforce. Within, say, a manufacturing plant of 100 employees, right? They can assess risk over time. And so I think that's how these types of technologies integrated with the current healthcare system can be used to help inform the workforce, and maintain a level of health amongst the employees as well as customers.
David, with Microsoft being involved in the digital tool landscape, what have been some of the most explored tools within your portfolio since the pandemic has occurred? Have people gravitated towards cloud analytics, or are they doing cloud collaboration with digital tools? What has been the uptick over the past few months?
Yeah, it's been really interesting because there are companies that have been on more of a transformation journey that have obviously de-scoped and reprioritized what they're going to be investing in. In some pockets, that's really increased both adoption and usage. You can imagine, Teams, our collaboration tool. We're seeing a lot of need for remote assistance, whether that's through a HoloLens or something that may not be as sophisticated, right? Being able to drop down digital work instructions and do training and certification on the fly. That tends to be areas that people are focused. From a supply chain standpoint, we're really trying to focus more on orchestration. So take the data that exists and be able to stand up the concept of like a control tower where you can identify risk and be able to mitigate it. You can respond more efficiently to unexpected events, which seem to be more the norm than the grief queue that they were, 2 months ago. And then within factories is really around trying to take some of the data that has been put up into the cloud. So for the companies that have gone through the first step in that journey of just getting connected, this data can become super powerful as you're trying to either move to different types of products or drive efficiency across the production process. I think one example is trying to take advantage of quality data and being able to look at how products are actually routed through more complex factories and syncing that back to MES production planning type capabilities. There's a set of applications that are known as low code or even no code. So once that data has been mapped into the right data models or data lakes in the cloud, you can turn on these type of platforms and almost unleash the power in the hands of the operators so that they can build dashboards or tools that can be accessed through smartphones or tablets or other devices that exist, in these facilities already. So I think it's really more of a MacGyver kind of an attitude of taking what exists and figure out how do you use it today. And what we find in getting into the next level discussions is that there are a lot of blind spots in these tools today. There's a lot of broken workflow that can be digitized. There's even data that doesn't exist that through these low code platforms, you can be able to start to populate and bring more of a science-based approach to it. Things like downtime or even quality reject codes. Instead of auditing or taking them through lab processes, you can stand them up and put them right, in the middle of production. So those are some of the more interesting things that we're talking to our customers about right now.
Let's take a break for a polling question. As we know, many of our readers have started using 3D printing more to do rapid prototyping since they are no longer working on site. And we want to know to what extent. So, to what extent do you rely on 3D printing as opposed to rapid injection molding to meet your prototyping requirements? Is it 3D printing only? Mainly 3D printing with some rapid injection molding? Half and half 3D printing, rapid injection molding? Mainly rapid injection with some 3D printing, or strictly rapid injection molding? While our audience is looking at that polling question, Professor Agor, can you elaborate on how the medical data infrastructure has responded to this pandemic? And how are we improving the tracking of COVID cases nationwide?
Yeah, sure. So Oregon State has instigated a TRACE program in which they have volunteers going from house to house monitoring and taking testing of COVID-19 tests. This is a sponsored organization by Oregon State. So this is one of the efforts that are being done here locally in Corvallis. I guess with respect to how they're monitoring the workforce, is that something that you asked about specifically? Or?
Yes, and I know that monitoring the workforce, and I know that a recent project of yours was funded by the National Science Foundation that ties to this. So if you can elaborate on both the project and the monitoring at large.
Sure. Yeah, monitoring and up-to-date kind of medical information, I think is extremely important because, like many other diseases, as we're learning more about this disease, the patterns in patients' medical histories and can make them, of course, more susceptible to diseases. And although I guess looking at medical data and various snapshots in time can be important, and kind of similar to what the workforce is doing, measuring temperatures and doing that kind of stuff, enforcing social distancing. Although they can be important, it's the patterns over time that really give you a significant amount of information, at least in an electronic health record kind of environment and in a hospital environment. And coupled with like comorbidities, patterns and other time-dependent vitals, and even patterns in visits, like to the hospital, like over time, or patterns in kind of where you're moving, can be all indicators of risk, in a hospital. So monitoring the workforce in that way, and I think the integration that I talked about before with your local healthcare facility or hospital system is very good, and it will be very important to assess risk in the future. And that's something that's one of the research questions that we are investigating in a rapids project sponsored by NSF. We're looking at the impact of certain policies, hospital systems enact policies to manage their medical surge capacity. Right? They wanted to prepare in order to prepare for an overwhelming amount of visits to the hospital specifically. And these policies have been enacted all over the country across all the hospital systems. And so for our project, we're looking at those policies as how they impact demand patterns to the hospital systems, and also how they impact non-COVID patients. One of the policies, for instance, here at Samaritan Health Services is they temporarily postponed elective surgeries. Right? So these are the types of things that they're doing to be able to manage their medical surge, and that will, of course, impact the workforce. People will tend to not want to go to the hospital, or maybe even can't go to the hospital because of a particular policy that was in place. And so we are looking into how those policies that were established here locally in Samaritan Health Services, and as well as another major hospital system, MedStar, in the DC area, 10 hospital system in the DC area. So both urban and rural environments, how those policies are impacting the community around them.
And, obviously that influx of data, what does that look like in terms of sharing that data with, companies, the employees and employers? This kind of information is going to probably needed to kind of make sure that you can reopen or even establish a strong workforce. How does that sharing between hospital information, patient information, and employers look like?
I think the sharing of information to employers will look like more of a policy level information, and then also the impacts of those policies will be, I think, very important to share kind of with their with employers and their employees to know what policies that they should be following with respect to the hospital system, and the impacts of those policies that could fall upon the patients themselves, and it's very specific to individual people, and so I think the communication, the data sharing, health information is protected health information, is protected information, and the sharing of that data can be very challenging, right, for specifics of those data. But I think at the policy level, I think that can be is something that is needed to be shared with the workforce, so that they can know what types of health services are available to them and when, right? And so they can get the help when they need it, and this type of information can and should be shared.
Right now, going forward, we're starting to think about what the future may look like. Certain states are starting to reopen, certain businesses are starting to reopen. David, what do you see as the tools that may be used to ensure people going forward can design safely? How will this impact workflow? And will the design shift extremely to the left? Are we going to see a lot of more pre-planning with digital concepts before we even get to production?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a couple, systematic changes that will manifest and kind of sustain once we get past this outbreak. Within Microsoft, we're planning for subsequent waves. So this isn't a one-time event, but that said, I think engineers in particular are going to be absolutely critical in terms of designing products, and those products that get manufactured and assembled, right? The whole DFM, in terms of how do we not just simulate the MVP prototypes, but how do we actually simulate the production processes? Over time, it will move upstream into supplier processes and probably logistics processes as well. So it's not very often that big manufacturers get a chance to do a greenfield, but a lot of companies are really rethinking their whole network strategy. And so there will be the opportunity to build new factories. There will be the opportunity to retrofit existing facilities, right? Which would include distribution centers as well. So I think it's a pretty exciting time in light of how depressing this has been for all of us. But engineers are really going to be the ones that are setting the table for how work gets done in the future. I think as you really connect that to the workforce needs, there is an opportunity to define the way that jobs will look in the future. It's not going to be, what I walked into in the mid-90s and in some of the plants where they were dirty and people would come in and do the same job, heavy, dirty, repetitive for 6.5 hours a shift. And so it's pretty exciting to be able to understand the technologies and what it's going to take to be more agile and more resilient. It's going to require people that know data science, that understand end-to-end processes, and then really can get that human connection for how to, I like to say take the robots out of humans. So let's automate the monkey work, right? The stuff that isn't really value added, and try to repurpose the human capital around complex problem solving, innovation, and some of the communications required to drive that change. So, technology is going to be a critical enabler, but really it's going to come back to the people that are designing the workplaces and the jobs of the future. I think to that end, one quick advertisement is yesterday Microsoft did announce a cloud specific to the healthcare industry. And so, recognizing that this is going to be a persistent theme going forward, it's really an opportunity to take some of the best practices and learnings and almost democratize that for other companies that may not be big, may not be global, may not have the budget to go spend on these tools on their own. So, hopefully that'll be a better way that we clear demand and supply, but more importantly, deliver a better and more personalized patient experience in healthcare.
And it's interesting that you're mentioning Greenfield Technologies, because you're right, we're in a unique situation where, for almost lack of a better term, we're starting from scratch in certain areas. What technologies particularly do you see filling that greenfield void? You mentioned data scientists, so are we going to see an increase in data IoT analytics, predictive maintenance? What else could be easily introduced into some new work settings that have never been introduced before?
Yeah, I'll start high and then make it practical. But when you look at the way that supply chains and production processes, in some cases even engineering functions, design functions, there is still a pretty big disconnect between planning that happens, the actual execution, and then the reporting of the results. So there's different processes and systems and even organizational departments that do that. I think this concept of a digital feedback loop that brings them together in more of a unified way. It's not so location or face-to-face dependent, but it really builds around the employee experience, the products themselves, the production processes, and then the whole supplier ecosystem. So as we think about, what are these next generation operating models or even business models where we're tying revenue to it, it's really going to look quite differently from a business architecture and then the underlying IT architecture. So a lot of where we see people looking at the next kind of wave of capabilities, it's going to be around true collaboration. It's going to be around, how do I visualize things? It's hard to do ideation and brainstorming when you're looking at a computer screen. So some of those collaboration techniques. And then I think really around, how do you design this concept of a remote operations center, and then more of a fully functioning command center across the value chain. So this isn't just getting data and turn it into dashboards. It's a bi-directional data flow where you can actually design, simulate, and then actually impact execution remotely, but doing that in a safe way, in a way that respects data privacy and even individual privacy as well.
Professor, as David just said, as we are starting to reintroduce the workforce into the factories and start opening up with new technologies, what can employers do to modify their healthcare practices, to personalize their medical resources within their own facilities? How can we make the workforce and the workplace feel safer, be safer by introducing some sort of security, some sort of reliance into the workforce?
Yeah, that's a great question, Carlos. And of course, we should, follow all the guidelines put forth by our government agencies like the CDC for the Center for Disease Control. And I guess also an important aspect that could be enforced is to seek help when you need it. I think in starting of this pandemic, when we started to social distance and the quarantines were enabled across the states, there was a fear that went across about going to seek your regular physician, your primary care physician, or get the surgery that you needed, or this type of thing, for fear of contracting the disease. And I think that because of this is one of the targets again of this research project that we're looking at. We're trying to look at the impact on the non-COVID cases, right? Because there are millions of those that tested, or that don't contract necessarily the disease, but then are not seeking those particular services, health services that they would normally seek. And I think something that employers can potentially do is to enforce that as we move, as of course in alliance with our government leaders and with your state laws and regulations and stuff, but to tell their employees that it's okay to seek help, that you don't necessarily need to not go in if you're needing some type of health service. So more data is always better for risk stratification. And in these, as we all know, we're in a data-driven world, so more data is always good. But it can be very tough. So just like David said, engineers are going to be, at least in the healthcare industry, are going to be key. In the frontline workers, the medical care physicians that I work with, both physicians and nurses, they're great at their jobs. They're great at their jobs, and so we need to complement that with what we do as engineers, right? And we need to help them engineer a better system, whether it's giving them decision support tools that take their data, and again, like David said, fit simulations about how the non-COVID cases, how the non-COVID patients, their regular patients, are being affected by the different policies that are in place, and then maybe they can reach out, instigate interventions like telemedicine, all of that stuff. But again, engineers are going to be key in analyzing and building these predictive tools and decision support tools for the healthcare frontline workers.
So as we wrap up our conversation, I'm going to ask you both for some final thoughts on what the path forward may be. We're still not 100% out of the woods, and there's a second wave that's possible later this year that may come our way. What are some of the steps that we can do to help mitigate that second wave? How can we be better prepared? Professor, I'll go with you first. What do you think that we can do going forward to help us be better prepared for the next upcoming months?
I think that, one thing is to take a look at the current policies that are in place at the local level, at your local hospital systems, right? Of course, there are national policies, but as we've seen, that this pandemic has affected areas across the world differently, right? Certain areas are getting impacted heavily, whereas here in Oregon, we are less impacted as, say, New York, of course, right? So I think looking at those specific policies that health systems are doing and enacting in order to prepare for, say, a second wave, and then, like you said, hopefully not, but in preparing for that second wave and managing your PPE, your staffing schedules, and all this type of thing, how many beds you have available, and the policies surrounding those, I think that's going to play a very key role, right? And evaluating what had happened over the past 3 months, right? What happened when you enacted all of these different policies at your local level? What happened to your patient population? And then see how it complements or how it works with the national policies that are in place, right? How do those impact the local health systems, and how can we target those policies to help those in our local communities?
David, same question. How can industries, how can your customers take better steps to be prepared over the next few months? What are they doing as we start seeing the light towards the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, we talked about, how some of these technologies are being accelerated in terms of their adoption around remote work, collaboration, bringing people back safely, and then really trying to leverage automation where it makes sense. I think we'll see that continue at scale. So right now it's being focused on the most critical products and the most critical customer segments. Over time, I think you're going to see, like the professor said, as this data starts to become more stable and we can start looking at trends, the ability to get more prescriptive and even being able to drive autonomous type analysis when those patterns are recognized, and we can start to more confidently prescribe what's going to happen before the current time. I think as it relates to product and process development, we're going to see an acceleration of digital twin type models. And again, that's a little bit of a loaded word, but we think of that as virtual replicas of physical reality, where you can bring in new kinds of computing power. You can bring in new types of training tools, whether that's mixed reality or something dialed down a little bit, but ultimately it's going to be getting back on that journey to building the digital feedback loops and the associated operating models that can really take advantage of that. So I think it'll be an interesting pace in terms of how fast it starts. It will be different based on industry, vertical, product type, and geography. But I think there will be a lot of lessons to learn. I think the last thing that I'm seeing is that companies are recognizing that they can't go it alone. So the ability to kind of build these virtual consortia between the government, between educational institutions, and even competitive companies in some cases to go tackle these problems, because they are bigger than any one company can address and any one company can tackle on their own. So I think, although remote work seems to be kind of a labor now, it actually may open up new innovation paths that didn't exist prior to the epidemic.
Well, hopefully we can start seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, and we can start moving forward, revisiting our supply chains, our manufacturing sites, our design engineering processes with some of the lessons we've learned, relying more on data analytics and digital tools to help create a better workforce and a better work process going forward. I want to thank the speakers for joining us today. This concludes our first conversation in our series of Rebooting After the Pandemic. Special thanks to our speakers, Professor Joseph Agor and David Bria, for joining us today. Also, special thanks to our supporters, COMSOL Multiphysics and Xcentric Mold and Engineering, for supporting today's conversation. Our next conversation in this series will take place on June 2nd and will focus on cleaner and safer workplaces after coronavirus. It will be moderated by our senior editor, Jeff Winters, and the conversation will focus on how workplaces and companies can implore better guidelines given to us by organizations like OSHA and the CDC to create a safer work environment. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope you join us for our next conversation.